Hello and welcome to the third episode of the Save British Farming podcast with me, Ollie Fletcher, and
Liz Webster, the founder of Save British Farming.
Wow, look
Someone
at that.
who's been trying hard to save British farming for a long, long time. And
does it wear you out, Liz?
It does. It's exhausting, but I'm still here fighting.
What
values
motivates
we're
you?
fighting for.
What motivates you?
A real strong attachment to post-war values, welfare state, equality, democracy, freedom.
Yeah. So it's bigger than farming. It's bigger than farming. This week we're going to be talking about things that have happened, which include another protest in Westminster and a Labour MP switching sides. Not walking the floor, but coming over to us in the countryside, which was lovely. We're also going to talk about factory farms. We're going to have a look at the Labour Party and ask if they're just performing neoliberalism in the countryside, as Thatcher did to the miners.
So, yeah, there was another protest yesterday in Westminster, which was led by another farmer called Oli Harrison and a group of farmers. And they brought down 3 big bits of kit. It's Pancake Day, and they wanted to reflect the cost of making a pancake and what it represents for the nation, I think was the idea. I think about somewhere between 2,000 and 5,000 people turned up. I have heard other numbers, but speaking to Farmers Weekly today, somewhere between 2,000 and 5,000. And what an amazing day they had. The weather was absolutely glorious. And the one thing they did get was permission from the police to play music. So there was a real festival atmosphere there. We did ask for music actually last time, and we were only allowed to play one song because we had other speeches. But somehow they got permission to have a bit of a disco in Whitehall, which was quite fun.
Yeah, and I think it was a good protest. I thought it was good that the large machines, the combines and sprayers and whatnot, differentiated it visually from previous protests for the media, which is something that you've always got to be mindful of when planning this kind of event. And it was very positive. It was delivering a good, nuanced message to the government, which is exactly what we wanted to see.
Yeah, and it also is good for people to march. It feels like you're doing something as you're marching, which obviously the tractor drivers get to do that and the ones that we've done. But yeah, I think it's good to switch it about and have different things. And a lot of it is perhaps about people feeling that they are doing something, that they are engaging in trying to, diminish their feelings of anxiety because of what is upon British farming and rural areas, thanks to what looks like Thatcherism.
Yes, well, more on that later. But we have seen the protests actually make some changes. We've seen Henry Tufnell, a Labour MP, a backbencher, come out publicly in support of farmers in the battle against the inheritance tax, which is a positive step.
Yeah, completely. Henry Tufnell is an interesting one. It's interesting in that I never thought that he would have been a Labour MP. I think his father used to be president of the CLA, and I would have put him much more in the Tory camp. But for whatever reason, he joined the Labour Party and got elected in a seat which I would have said was normally Conservative as well, which is extraordinary. And it's good for us. His dad is a farmer, and they farm not far from me here in the Cotswolds. And I think it's what we need. We need more Labour MPs to find a platform and a community to get behind this, to fight for rural seats, because they might sort of think, well, I'm only in for one term, but equally, they may be thinking about holding onto their seat and crossing the floor at another time. There was a Tory MP who did that with Starmer, wasn't it? I can't remember his name now. In the Red Wall, he crossed the floor at some stage, and then he has been re-elected as a Labour MP. So I think it is a sensible thing for them to do, and it's certainly from our focus and point of view, we want to try and encourage those MPs, those Labour MPs, to find a platform and a campaign to push against the Labour leadership.
Yes, the CLA, by the way, for anyone who doesn't know, is the Country Land and Business Association, which is sort of like the trade representative body for the landowning class, as opposed to the farming class as represented by the National Farmers Union. But we're all on the same side at the minute because the entire countryside is under attack. I actually replaced Henry Tufnell on a Farmers Weekly panel at the Oxford Farming Conference earlier this year in January, and used the position to call for Steve Reed to resign, which I feel a little bad about this week, because I feel like I humiliated Henry Tufnell. Had he not backed out, you see, that wouldn't have happened, and I'm sure somebody slapped him on the wrist for that. But I think it's very good to see a backbench MP stand up. Especially, there was some controversy because before the budget announcement, his family transferred some land from his parents to his brother, which was then flouted in the press as a potential, insider trading sort of situation. But I think he avoided that, and then has come out, I think quite fervently on our side, which is good to see.
Yeah, because what we need is a movement like the 22 committee that they have in the Tory party. We need something like that in the Labour Party. And that's why, we're really keen for people to write to their Labour MPs to get them on this issue, because food security is so important. And now there's more and more talk of rearming. What we're keen to do is to try and get Labour MPs to recognise that part of the rearmament plan should be to ensure that we've got a food production plan, because at the moment we don't have one.
Yeah, I've been reading about this week for my video on my YouTube channel, and we get about 30% of our food from Europe, and we produce about 60% of it ourselves. But a lot of the countries in Europe are not, we import a lot from France and Germany, which themselves only are really just about self-sufficient. They just import stuff themselves to then export stuff to us. So it seems like if something happens in Europe that means that they're not prepared to do that for whatever reason, we are going to be without about 30% of our food. And America at the moment is only about 3%, I think, of our food, but that presumably could increase, which I presume is where the government is looking to avoid starvation, which is not, it's not great for a few different reasons. We have a Discord on my Farming Explained YouTube channel, and there's some American farmers on that, and they say that Trump is attacking them in a similar way to our government attacking us, and that they've put all these tariffs on exported, and then the tariff is weirdly, have you seen the tweet? It's very strangely worded. It says that there's tariffs on tariffs on export, sorry. So American farmers who had been exporting goods won't be able to do so easily. So they'll have to just produce stuff for the domestic market. And then he finishes it off saying, "Have fun," with an exclamation mark, which is very strange. It's very strange.
It's mad, yes. And I've seen lots of videos of lots of the ranchers, cattle ranchers, really, voted for Trump, and now they're seriously regretting it. So it's fascinating in many ways. It's got Brexit parallels. I know you don't like me talking about Brexit, but it does have parallels, except the sort of dawning of Brexit was delayed by COVID. It was masked by COVID, so people didn't quite see it. Whereas now they can't blame Trumpism on anything else, because it's just coming. Trump has shocked the world. I mean, last Friday, it was an absolute earthquake moment for the world when he attacked Zelensky with JD Vance. And subsequently, JD Vance has insulted us by saying we haven't fought a war in 30 years. And I mean, you couldn't really make it up. God knows what's going to be going on by this time.
But our government is looking to America and potentially to places like Australia to pick up any slack that might appear when we stop being able to get food from Europe, if there is a war there, or if climate change accelerates. And there is a movement to stop that happening.
But this is the problem that people don't completely understand. If you're going to import meat from America, it can come on a boat. If you're going to import some beef, it can come on a boat, and it can mature on the boat. You can't import a lot of fresh goods like we do from the EU. A lot of the fresh goods that we're getting now in supermarkets are going off a lot quicker. And that's because they're spending so much time in the trucks getting here because of all the red tape. And a lot of other stuff is also coming from Morocco, in fact, which is coming further. How can we import a whole load of stuff from America, fresh stuff? are Mexico. Canada imports a lot of fresh stuff from Mexico, and it arrives by plane. We don't have the resources to manage that amount of food to come by plane. Most of the imported food in this country, 40% of it comes via Rotterdam, via Dover. Most of it comes from there. And I'm sure that's probably why they're looking at new runways, but even if you had another runway, it's still not going to be able to bring in enough fresh food to feed nearly 70 million people. None of it makes any sense whatsoever.
No,
It's crazy.
So there is a trade deal that is going to allow Australia to import their beef and lamb and presumably other stuff, you all know more than me, onto the British market. And there is a movement trying to stop that for environmental reasons, saying that the trade agreement violates the UK government's own laws on environmental targets. I phrase that badly. Would you like to explain briefly what's going on to stop that, Liz?
Yeah, Feedback, an environmental group, are challenging the Australia trade deal, which was signed, I can't remember if it was 2 or 3 years ago now, but when Boris Johnson was still in office. And he famously signed it over dinner with Scott Morrison, and he'd been drinking copious amounts of wine, and signed this terrible deal. He signed Britain away on the back of a napkin, apparently. He basically gave away, he ceded the entire kingdom, is what the Australians said. And this group started challenging it, but it got delayed in the courts. And they're challenging it on the basis that in our signing up to the Paris Climate Accord, there should have been an impact assessment to evaluate the environmental impact of that trade deal. And they didn't do that, as well as they argue there was no parliamentary oversight. So it's very delayed happening because it got lost in the courts. And I think the Australia trade deal exceeded over a year ago now. And every year that it's in place, the quotas go up and more meat will come in from Australia. So we've got pictures from Costco of a whole load of Australian meat in this country. So it is here. You won't know if you're eating it if you go to a restaurant or a takeaway, or if you're eating ready meals. That could be Australian or even Brazilian meat, because we've got other meat coming in because of WTO. So anyway, this challenge is actually, it's got what you call a cost capping order. And there's been a lot of talk about these cost capping orders, which are given to cases which are special, specifically about the environment. So there are a lot of judicial reviews about building projects. And this government are trying to get rid of this special agreement, which means that groups can bring these court cases and not be deterred by huge adverse costs. And now the Labour government are trying to challenge this group's right to a cost capping order. And that hearing is this Friday in the Royal Courts of Justice. And I'll be going up there, and hopefully there'll be a few others. And we're going to dress up as the 7th of March, dress up as the sacrificial lambs of the Australia deal, which is what we are. And hopefully get some attention and some publicity for this really important judicial review, because if it wins and it goes all the way and the courts say actually this Australia deal is not been done correctly, then Parliament will have to get the impact assessment and put it through the parliamentary process and see if it passes. And that will take some considerable time, and that will be a real problem for this Labour Party and the aggressive way in which they're trying to forge ahead with what I see as the Brexit plan all along.
Yeah, it's funny though, isn't it? Because then on a domestic level, you've got Steve Reed, the environment minister. We saw him talk at the National Farmers Union conference, and they are pushing us towards less environmentally friendly farming methods as well. Although they dress it up much differently to that. They emphasize that they want nature to be integrated with farming. They are stripping all of the government support that has been given to farmers. Farms famously are quite uneconomic to operate, so they need some degree of government assistance. And I think, is it all countries other than the UK subsidise agriculture? I've seen that written. I don't know if it's true.
In one way or another. So Australia and New Zealand don't specifically give food subsidies. America heavily subsidises agriculture. China does as well. But ultimately, we have come away completely, or we will be away by 2027 of any subsidising food whatsoever. And food is no longer recognised as a public good, which shocked me with my post-war values, that the government is saying, well, if we run out of food, it's not our problem. That's really what it means. And they've made the environment a public good.
It's very strange. But what Steve Reed was saying is that farmers should diversify away from agriculture. So we should get a different revenue stream, essentially, to privately subsidize food production if it's something we believe deserves to continue. Smart. But nevertheless, the central premise of Steve Reed's speech at the NFU was that if you're not profitable, there is no place for you in the future. So it had this fundamentally economic idea beneath it, which is not about environmentalism, it's about economics, that if you are running an unprofitable business, you are therefore inefficient, which is something I object to, but he seems to believe to be absolutely true, and therefore you should be crushed. So it's this narrative that farms don't make much money. This is the fault of the farmers. This is because they're small, they're not big corporations, therefore they're inefficient. And if they are consolidated into larger units with less farmers, those things will be more efficient, and then they won't need subsidies. Perhaps they will provide food better, and in essence, it's pushing us from a sort of family farm setup, which we've had traditionally since the war for lots of reasons, including the fact that they are efficient, I would argue, towards a factory farm setup, which is not something I think anybody really wants to see.
No, well, particularly as it's so bad for the environment, really bad for the animals, it's really bad for health, as well as it's a huge biosecurity risk. And again, it's got more risk of actual food collapse, because you've got, as we've seen with the avian flu recently, because they're all in one area, mass intense number of animals, that if there is an infection, then a whole load of them go down. So it isn't a good idea. It's also it feels very undemocratic, because nobody's actually voted for this. Everybody voted for this green reality of everything is going to be more environmentally friendly, supposedly, and farmers are going to be made to do even more environmental stuff, whereas behind the smokescreen there is massive USA intensive farming happening, and it's increased by 20% in the last 5 years, and a lot of them in Northern Ireland. And there's another one they're trying to open in Norfolk, in Liz Truss's old seat at Cranswick, a mega farm, which will be the biggest mega farm in Europe, which will be a mixture of pigs and chickens if they get the planning permission. So it feels very deceitful in that we've got this growth agenda, and they're saying that everything, the planning laws are holding everything back. And yet we've been absolutely bogged down with this environmentalism and being told that we weren't environmental enough to then change what is sustainable farming, which is what we always have done in this country, to American factory farming. Feels the ultimate deceit.
Yeah, it's very, very strange. And this segues into what the hell the Labour Party are doing, because none of this, to me, seems particularly left-wing. We must remember that after the Second World War, the Labour Party nationalised or socialised all of the key national infrastructures, the energy, water, railways, post, all this sort of stuff was nationalised. And agriculture was socialised as well. We got cheap food policies, and that empowered farmers as workers to own their own land, which is efficient. If you have small family farms, they can keep food prices low, essentially by not taking a wage. They take their own risk. But also, if you have like a small dairy herd, say of 100 cows, they can graze, which is very efficient because they essentially look after themselves. In the summer, you have to have, one person to milk them, or if you have a robot, no people to milk them. And that's it. That's the whole thing. Whereas if you have a massive, factory farm in inverted commas with 1,000 cows, you have to feed them silage all year round. You have to take grass to them, which is extra steps. Also, if you get rid of all of the family farms and replace them with wage laborers, those people will actually have to be paid a wage, as they should be, but that will inevitably push the food price up, or just make agricultural businesses inherently more risky because workers themselves can't stomach the risk by not taking a wage. So I don't see that it's any more efficient to sink the small businesses. And on top of that, the reason that these businesses are unprofitable is often not because they're inefficient. quite the opposite. It's because they've been crushed into the ground by the supermarkets, which generally means they have to be efficient to survive that. So at home, when we were milking, we didn't make any money at all for years and years and years because we were being crushed by the supermarkets. But that meant we got incredibly efficient. We got really, really good at producing lots of very cheap milk because we had to do that to stay in business. If we couldn't keep up with the very low price that we were being forced to accept, we would have been destroyed. And the Labour Party is looking at this and looking at all the farms, thinking, well, you're not making very much money. Your capital is worth a lot and your incomes are crap. Then, there's no place for you in the future, as Steve Reed said. But this just fails to understand the basic premise of economics in the countryside, which is that farming is uneconomic, essentially. But that doesn't mean it's bad. You can be very good at farming and it can still be uneconomic, which is something the party need to recognize because we all need food.
The mad thing is that we got rid of our mines and we're now subsidizing landowners in North America to grow trees and chop them down and send them over here and burn them in Drax Power for energy. And so the whole argument for getting rid of British farming because you don't want to subsidize food makes no sense. It isn't right about that. That just isn't it. Perhaps they want to consolidate production into a smaller area so that they can build more infrastructure, potentially. But if you look at the Dutch, the Netherlands food model, they are incredibly efficient in the Netherlands at producing food intensively. But they could do that more democratically. They could also encourage farmers to intensify by offering grants. But actually what we have got, and which Dan Needle sent me a tweet, I'll talk about that in a bit. But what I believe we've got is this government who've been very overt about their cozying up to BlackRock. And we've got this increase in factory farming and we've got these, this frustration with the planning regs. And I sense that they are definitely delivering Thatcher's plan, Patrick Minford's plan, to really get rid of farming, largely intensify more food production here and import more food from further away. I pointed that out in a tweet, and Dan Needle called me a conspiracy theorist because what other explanation is there for what is being done to the countryside? It's definitely not an economic argument because getting rid of farms also impacts the rural economy all around it. The people that sell you machinery, seeds, your agronomists, all of this local economy where I live will be hugely impacted if there's no longer family farms. And then, yes, it's a completely different economic model with a factory farm, which is, I'm sure, what they're learning. They will learn if Transvit get their way in Norfolk. And the locals don't want it, and they smell really badly. The damage that is done to the environment is horrendous. So it really is very deceitful, as I've said. I mean, maybe they're banking on people being so hungry that they won't notice that this is happening. In America, you can get away with it because it's a huge country and the farms are all in the middle where hardly anyone lives. In Britain, we're very densely populated, so it's pretty hard to escape these big factories if we have too many more of them.
I feel that all of this is a sort of corruption of what it means to be left wing, because I feel traditional British socialism was predominantly an economic position that then had a social part bolted onto it. So economically, it's about the welfare of everybody as a whole and the nation, which is why they nationalize stuff, which compares to a right-wing position, which is more libertarian. It's about the individual. And then if you are to take the social side of that, in the left-wing position, it's all about the community, and the society as a whole is more important than the individual, which then is almost a little bit small c conservative, because it's about the continuation of the traditional communities and social institutions, whereas on the right-wing side, it's all about the individual and the individual's freedom to behave as they will, which is fine, not taking a side there. But I feel that today, a lot of people on the left, particularly the middle class, don't have economic concerns. So they don't see the economic dimension that once defined the left, particularly immediately after the war. So they see it culturally, and they think the left wing, they're the good guys, they're the progressive people. So then they define being left wing essentially in the ability of the individual to act freely. And that's sort of what it is. It's all cultural, which is where, of course, you get the culture war stuff from. But then this sort of cultural progressivism without any particular plan leads us down to, I think, essentially what is Thatcherism in an obscure way, because we have in the countryside traditional communities and small owner-occupied businesses, which I think you could very easily argue are socialist. If a farmer owns his own land, nobody is exploiting them through rent. It's all very egalitarian, whereas the desire from people like Steve Reed saying, if you're not profitable, there is no future for you. They're dismantling these communities, but seemingly with a desire to allow the free market to function more effectively. As it stands, traditional rural communities stand in the way of the free market functioning effectively. Farmers could make loads of money by covering their land in solar panels, but they choose not to do that because they believe in the importance of food. They want to maintain their rural communities by continuing to operate within them. It's a barrier to the operation of the market, and it's therefore a barrier to making money on a just macroeconomic scale, growth in inverted commas. But surely this is just Thatcherism. It's social progressivism. Thatcher famously said there's no such thing as a society. It's destroying communities in order to allow the free market to function more effectively, which is absurd because it is coming from the Labour Party, who surely should believe the opposite.
Well, they should, and that's what we need to try and aim our fire at, in ensuring that they do bite back at the leadership. And we did experience some of this under Blair when he brought in PFIs, tuition fees, and obviously the Iraq decision that was really very much right-wing policy, Thatcherism. I mean, she famously said that Tony Blair was continuing her work. But it was light touch compared to what we've got now. Although Tony Blair was quite aggressively trying to restructure agriculture policy, but he couldn't get it through the European Union. That's what protected us. So look, this is nothing new. We had this in the empire. You only have to look back to what happened in Ireland with the famine and how it was left up to the markets, and the same with the famine that they had in India. It is a belief that everything is about wealth and those who are wealthy, and if you can't manage to keep on the treadmill, then so be it. It's survival of the fittest, and that's really where we have marched into, I think, which I find frightening and very disturbing.
Yeah, it's just so strange to me that this is coming from the left, because it's so basic. And I had this when I was at university. I mean, one of the reasons I came back to the farmers, because I just thought that whole political world was so morally bankrupt. But a large part of that was because I would go to the Labour Club at the university, and then everybody there would be middle-class neoliberals, but they think that because they're the good guys, that makes them left-wing. And it is that simple. But it's frustrating because these are people who studied PPE at Oxford. These are the people who are supposed to be the intellectual elite, who will go on to, well, a lot of them are civil servants, but I'm sure many of them will go on to be members of parliament. And they seem to have no self-awareness and no understanding of how their ideology actually reflects on the world, because it is just neoliberalism.
Our political system is fed by donors, and we have got think tanks as I call them, in Tufton Street in particular, who really have got they're offering financial incentives to parties, and sort of saying, well, I'll give you this, we'll fund your election campaign, and what we want back is this when you get into power. And that's why everything's going wrong. And that's why it doesn't make any sense, because you've got wealthy donors coming in from countries outside of Britain saying, well, actually, we want to, we'd like to get into the British agricultural market. And here we go, we'll give you this and we'll support your campaign to be elected, whoever. And this is what we expect in return. And this is what is wrong with Britain today. But this is what exactly happens in America. We've just become more Americanized. And I don't believe that anyone wants it, or not many people want it. Nigel Farage wants it, but I don't think that most Brits do. I think people have been dissuaded and confused by the culture wars and all of the games that they play to trick people into voting against their vested interest.
Yeah, it's not. I mean, in farming, it's very explicit because Steve Reed has just doubled down on Michael Gove's vision for the countryside. So the Conservative Party ripped all of the subsidies away and sort of sent us on a different path to the one we had been on since the Second World War. But then Steve Reed has doubled down on it. And I think actually he's gone more right wing than Michael Gove did, because although, as we will, I'm sure, discuss on here, the history of environmentalism is very much a right wing political history. And Michael Gove's was an environmentalist vision, which I think is wrong but ideologically consistent. Whereas Steve Reed has gone much more extreme. In Michael Gove's vision, you still had state intervention. The state was fixing what he saw as a market failure, where the free market wouldn't provide nature. There's no nature in the free market. So the state would monetize it and subsidize nature, which, you know, in some ways sounds quite left-wing. You're fixing a market failure. Whereas Steve Reed doesn't even seem to want to do that. He's frozen the capital grants. He says, if you're not profitable, there's no place in the future for you. It seems to me, at best, the same as Michael Gove's vision, but faster, more accelerated, and therefore more extreme, or just absolutely off the deep end. Or like just so much more right wing. But it's from the Labour Party. It's such a difficult thing to wrap your head around, that we've had this Conservative government, and then the Labour Party are elected on a platform of being more sensible than them, essentially. And then
they said they were going to change everything, and they haven't changed.
Yes, change. Yes, of course, was their manifesto commitment. But also, I think this is much broader than just the countryside, because you have the growth plan, which is very similar to Trussonomics. But I think
what they're doing with education is the same. It's the same Michael Gove education policies being hammered down. So it's nothing's changed. Nothing.
I mean, the plan is to deregulate and get growth. It's very, very strange. But are we seeing a split in the Labour Party because of this? We've seen the International Development Secretary, is that what she's called? Annalise Dodds has resigned over the Keir Starmer's withdrawal of international funding, which actually I think
terrible. I'm very upset about it.
It is terrible, but I think it's symptomatic of a very strange thing the Labour Party are doing at the moment, which is to do something unpopular but pit it against another specific thing. So they remove the international aid because they need to increase defence spending. They put an inheritance tax on farms because they need more money for the NHS. And it's all very either or.
They want people to think that the economy is like their own personal bank accounts. It is not. But it's a very useful tool. They did it with the beaching cuts in the 1960s. They said we can't afford them anymore. And it actually was nothing to do with that. They decided that they wanted to change the economic model and make everybody own a car and drive on new roads. It's as simple as that. So they use it as an excuse. They said they used the financial crisis as an excuse to get to ensure austerity, which was the beginning, the real fast beginning of the end of universalism. I mean, this has been coming since Thatcher got rid of eye care and NHS eye care, which we used to have when I was children, and NHS dentistry. And now we've got it coming across the board, you know, really aggressively, with privatization coming through like an aggressive cancer. And that is the American system. And that's really where we're headed. That's what I said we've been headed. We've got the tuition fees. Oh, we can't afford these university free fees anymore. You've got to pay for them. It's the American system. As to why they think it's better, I don't know, because I don't think it is better if you look at what America is in itself. But they seem to think that squeezing, I think Boris Johnson did a speech at the Margaret Thatcher Society, or whatever it is they had, referring to us as a box of cornflakes, and the harder they squeeze the pack, the more float to the top, the more successful ones. And that's what I think they see in America. The successful ones are probably the tech bros, who are obviously successful for themselves, and they're continuing to just hoover everything up for themselves, like pharaohs, like greed. In fact, perhaps pharaohs were probably more humanitarian than some of these tech bros. But I think it's a bad model, and I think it's going to end in disaster.
Surely, if you crunch a box of cornflakes, they just all end up in lots of little bits. They're very
that's
brittle,
the eugenics part of it as well, because they do believe in.
They're gonna engineer an iron cornflake that cannot not be crushed.
Yeah, well, I went to boarding school, you didn't, but there is this thought that you need to not be soft on your kids and send them off to boarding school and get them tough, and that is kind of the thought.
And that's why you're as tough as you are, Liz.
Probably. Until next time, hopefully.
Yes. Until
we will come back and sort out the problems of the world.
Yes, it'll be excellent. I look forward to it. I'll see you then.